Hi, good afternoon. This is Jackie Cassidy at Genscape. We are going to start the webinar in about 2 minutes to let any last-minute attendees sign on. So we'll go back to being on mute right now, and then we'll come on at about 2:02. Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Genscape webinar to cover California's new LCFS frontier. My name is Jackie Cassidy, and I am joined today by my colleague Will Martin. So first, we're going to give you a little bit of a heads up on how to listen and participate in the webinar today. So we really appreciate questions and comments. And you'll see via the slide that's presented currently that you can submit your questions to us anonymously or via detail, and we will either answer them at the end of the presentation or directly after. We won't be able to get to everything throughout the life of the presentation. We'll be here for about an hour today. Also, there is a survey at the end of the webinar. If you would please provide us some feedback as to what we presented and how it was provided via the platform. This helps us as we do other webinars in the future for the industry. And if you are going to experience any technical issues throughout the presentation, you can either hit refresh or clear your cache, and then it should be okay. Or contact us directly via the questions box as well. So as I mentioned, my name is Jackie Cassidy. I'm the manager for business development on the agriculture and biofuels team. I take industry information related to the RFS2 for EPA guidelines, as well as LCFS and other variations on compliance issues so that we can develop business opportunities both domestically and internationally. And I'll kick it over to my colleague Will Martin, who's also going to be presenting today.
Hi Jackie, thanks for getting this rolling. My background at Genscape is mostly in quality assurance monitoring, but I also do a lot of economic research in biofuels, especially with our ethanol supply chain monitoring products. So I'm a little bit newer to LCFS, but I think we both have some interesting things to add here in this webinar.
Yes, there's a lot of detail to cover. So. Yeah. With that, I will start with just a general background on Genscape and what we do in terms of QAP. We provide both QAP services, quality assurance services for fuel producers within the EPA's Renewable Fuel Standard, as well as within California's Low Carbon Fuel Standard. We are a company that provides real-time monitoring for information within the energy services industry. And we entered into the agriculture and biofuel space about 4 years ago. So today's agenda, we're just going to give a brief overview of the LCFS timeline, handle some of the recertification and new pathway registration applicabilities. We'll look at some historic market trends, as well as credit market compliance timelines, and then we'll talk about growth opportunities for a certain set of fuel types. And then I'll go over just a brief overview of what Genscape offers for LCFS verification and monitoring services. And at the end, we'll take your questions and answers. Again, if we don't get to it or if we run out of time, we will follow up with questions via email directly, and you're always encouraged to reach out to us for individual one-on-one meetings. So I'll get started. The slide that you're seeing here is just an overview of the timeline from the genesis of the low carbon fuel standard in 2010 to where it stands today with the most recent adoption by the Office of Administrative Law and CARB. So there's been a lot of variations from 2010 until 2015. There was, a push from the industry to reassess if there were, amendments or required updates to CI values throughout the pathway genesis, looking at that in 2012 and 2013. So as it stands now, there's been modifications to CI values. There's been flexibility as for new pathways. So we're looking forward to what this LCFS standard looks like moving forward in 2016 and 2017 as the current existing pathways get recertified and new pathways come into the mix. So I'm going to go over some of the guidelines that are required for some of the important dates that you might want to consider if you're looking at either going for a recertification or a new pathway registration. Some important dates. So CARB has released what is now called the Alternative Fuels Portal, and starting November 10th of this year and through January 31st of 2016, you will be encouraged to submit a request to ARB for a legacy pathway recertification or a new pathway application as well. You'll see listed here that CARB is going to review legacy recertifications and new pathways based on the following priority for fuel types. So they will be reviewing ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and then variations on natural gas and other fuel types based on the scheme that you see here. So Q1 of 2016 will be ethanol review, and certified CI values will be released on what's called a batch fuel release date. So if you're thinking about that from an ethanol perspective, the same date will be applied to all CI certified pathways for ethanol within Q1 of 2016. So the scheme here is, and the concept here is that if you get in before January 31st of 2016, CARB will have enough time, hopefully, to approve and certify your pathway before the sunset date of December 31st, 2016, when all previously approved CIs will actually be sunset and will be no longer valid in the market. So in case of a recertification, you're going to want to submit based on some of the timelines that we have in here. So I gave you the clarification in that your fuel type will not be certified with the CI value ahead of the date for the actual batch type. So Q1, Q2, Q3 for the fuel types, everyone within the January 31st, 2016 deadline will be released on the same date. And then ahead of your CI value being recertified and released, CARB will have an approval process with you in case you don't like the CI value or you need to provide modifications to your facility data that you submitted. So here is another overview of how you would go about submitting through the Alternative Fuels Portal for legacy recertification or a new pathway. You'll have to provide all the required additional information that the CARB staff lists based on your fuel type. So I have listed here, if you're a new Tier 1 fuel, you're not eligible for legacy recertification. If you are a Tier 2 pathway, you need to first review the Tier 2 lookup table to determine the next steps. If you're a former method 2A or 2B, then the CARB staff will use your existing application data and then internally convert it to the California GREET Model 2.0 as applicable for your new CI certification. And as it says here, if CARB was to determine any inconsistencies within your former application under the former LCFS regulations related to the new regulations, then they're going to require you to request a new pathway certification. So in that interim step, if everything moves forward, then the next step would be that you'd receive a new CI pathway value. CARB would work with you, and you would either approve it via this attestation letter, or you'd submit additional documentations to modify the CI value to what you prefer. So things to consider if you're looking at who should certify for, or who should look at a legacy pathway. It would be producers who have a valid method 2A or 2B CI under the previous regulation, or have a valid method 1 CI with a reference pathway that is in the Tier 2 lookup table, or if you have an active fuel pathway code. If your documentation that you previously submitted is still within steady state of operations, or if you just do not wish to update any parameters and you want CARB to review and they will determine whether or not you're eligible for a legacy recertification. So it's also important to note here that the Tier 1 and Tier 2 calculators are available on the California GREET Model website currently. This can also be accessed via the CARB website. And another thing to think about if you're determining which pathway you fall under, there will be no feedstock-only pathways as we move forward into the new version of LCFS. If you are a feedstock-only producer, you're going to have to do a joint application with a fuel producer in order to get into the new system. So this, I just presented this as an example of how a Tier 1 submission process would go about. Of course, you would submit for the request initially, and then moving past the submission for request, you would provide the GREET modeling assessment. CARB would do an initial evaluation and ask you for any additional requests. There'd be a professional engineering review and evaluation of your submitted documentation. And then if everything moved forward, CARB would issue your certification for a Tier 1 CI value. Past the issue of the certification, assuming that everyone agrees on the CI value, then you would get activation within the reporting system, the LRT. And CARB would then finalize or publish your final CI value to the LCFS website. Same concept looking at Tier 2 type submissions. So, things to consider here. A method 1 would use the fuel table that's provided in the LCFS regulations. Method 2A would have some additional requirements related to the substantiality for their innovative process. So basically what this means is you're going to be required throughout the documentation submission process to demonstrate that you would have at least a 20% reduction in emissions via your improved production efficiency process. When I say this, it's actually related to what's called source to tank or well to tank, that portion of the CI, and not your greenhouse gas emissions portion or your indirect land use change emissions portion. Those would be separate for the substantiality portion of the Tier 2 process. And then just a few modifications that have definitely been brought up in a lot of the workshops and ongoing public meetings that CARB has had. And these questions have also come into us at Genscape. Will there be a provisional or temporary assignment of CI values as CARB's going through the review process? It's important to note that CARB has stated that, if you don't submit by the January 31st, 2016 deadline, you can do so afterwards, but you would have to petition the executive officer for either a temporary or provisional CI, and you'd be granted that after the batch fuel release date associated with your fuel type. And that's just to give, a little bit of a competitive advantage to those that submitted via the portal ahead of the January 31st deadline. So here you'll see a quick overview A provisional CI just means, new or innovative producers that have less than 2 years worth of full commercial production data. You can petition the executive officer for a provisional pathway if you have operating data for at least 1 calendar year. And they note that there's a possible expedition of the staff review and certification ahead of the batch fuel release date, but it's not guaranteed. A temporary CI value would be for a fuel supplier that doesn't have the sufficient production data, so they're calling these kind of the startup mode production facilities. And then I made a note here that you would apply for a provisional pathway, as I mentioned earlier. And again, you would petition the executive officer for that pathway. And then any of the fuel pathway certifications that are issued under the temporary process would only be valid for 2 quarters worth of credit generation. Following that, that CI value would no longer be valid within the LRT, and you wouldn't be generating credits with the temporary or provisional CI value. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Will for some LCFS historic market trends.
Thanks, Jackie. And before I get going on my section, I just wanted to reiterate that we invite all of your questions. I know some people came in later. You can add questions at any time, and if we don't get to them, we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end, but if we don't, we'll also try to answer some of those in a follow-up to this webinar. So please, anytime during the presentation, feel free to submit your questions. So I'm going to dig into some of what's happened in the market historically before the new regulations. So what you're looking at in this slide is the historic credit generation in terms of volume. This is some data that ARB releases periodically. It's not regularly released, but this data was released fairly recently and provides a good overview of what fuel types were in the market. So not huge surprises there. As you can see, biodiesel, renewable diesel, and then various types of ethanol, both cane and corn ethanol, made up the largest portion of credits in the past. And then just breaking that down in a different way, I'm going to get more into the breakout of different types of ethanol and their different CI values later. But in this chart, you can see ethanol is all grouped together. So you can see that in the years between 2011 and this year, how biodiesel and renewable diesel have taken up a larger share of the credits that are entering the LCFS market. And finally, prices, which I think a big reason for showing this is just how sort of all over the map prices have been, both the range from low to high and then what they've done over time. And I wanted to set this up too because what we've been hearing, and obviously we're not going to try to predict prices, but you see even in a lot of ARB documentation that they refer to prices at the $80 level or sometimes even higher. And we're starting to see prices at $80 or $100 mentioned by other marketers and other information providers. So definitely the trajectory is upward with the renewal of the legislation. And so I'm going to pass it back to Jackie, and she's going to go into some credit market compliance.
Thanks, Will. So I will go over just, and I won't be able to go into everything in full detail, but give you an idea of kind of what the annual compliance year would look like and a few of the nuances to the credit marketplace. So here you'll see some terms and definitions that show up in the regulations. You have the credit clearance market, which occurs when a regulated party, fails to comply with their credit and deficit regulation obligations. The credits are only applicable for compliance under the credit clearance market for the immediate prior year's compliance obligation. And the stipulation is that you must have retired all of your credits that are current
Hi everyone, we're just experiencing some technical difficulties. If you could just hang on for 1 minute, we'll try and get back on. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry about that. We had some technical issues. So back to where I left off. So talking about the cost containment market. So you'll look at that and you'll see that it tells you basically regulated parties are able to pledge credits for purchase, and when they do so, they'll be required to accept any offer at the current year's maximum price, which is determined by carbon. We'll address that later. So exemptions here are credits that have either already been sold or contracted for sale, so there is no duplication in these sales within the cost containment market. The term below, carryback. So carryback credits they can be used to meet a portion of a regulated party's obligation based on the assumption that that party also retires all of the credits it currently has in its bank. And for the previous compliance year, regulated parties that want to elect to use carrybacks must do so by having submitted their annual compliance report by April 30th to the executive officer. They must also identify the number and source of credits, and then follow the retirement requirements as I just set forth. Other things to mention on this slide would be, it's important to note that credits that are generated within the LCFS program will not be eligible for transfer to meet obligations in other programs, such as the California Cap and Trade or under the Renewable Portfolio Standard. Now, you can generate credits and receive emission reduction credits based on LCFS and RFS too, but again, not under other parties or other schemes. So, one more thing to hit on the credit clearance market. I'm not sure if you could hear me when our sound dropped out. Basically, if a regulated party doesn't retire the sufficient credits for its year-end compliance, a pro rata share of credits will be determined, and then that's what they would purchase off the credit clearance market. That pro rata share is determined by the executive officer. This is just a timeline of kind of what the year looks like for annual compliance within the LCFS. So at the beginning of the year, between January 1st and March 31st, you have what's called an extended carryback period. We talked about the carryback credits on the previous slide. Something to take note of with carryback credits, the regulation stipulates that you must initiate and complete a carryback credit transaction within 10 business days. And all carryback credits need to have been completed, all those transactions completed by March 31st. So then it'll move into the credit clearance market if there is not a regular ongoing LCFS market between April 1st and April 30th. Anyone that wishes to sell within the credit clearance market would then pledge within the system. The regulated parties need to submit their annual compliance reports to the executive officer before April 30th so that the appropriate pro rata calculations can be determined and issued. And then the executive officer will just kind of make a note as to whether or not they're going to have a credit clearance market. They'll do that around May 15th. And then moving forward, so once the regulated parties have submitted their annual obligations and the executive officer has had time to assess them, anyone who needs to submit for a credit clearance market obligation will be notified of that by June 1st. And then you'll see on the slide that the credit clearance market takes place between June 1st and July 31st. Again, that's only if a credit clearance market is issued by the executive officer. Otherwise, it's kind of standard operating procedure. You know, you've got deadlines for your quarterly reporting, and then if there is a credit market clearance, again, it's going to end by July 31st, and anybody that participated in the credit clearance market would need to submit an amended annual compliance report by August 31st. And this is just another overview of kind of what it looks like from a regulated party standpoint, and then anybody that wants to sell within the credit market. So, you know, you're going to have anyone, again, that, you know, didn't meet their annual compliance obligation. The credits can be purchased via the clearance market and only used for the purpose of meeting your obligation. They can't be transferred or sold as normal credits. And then, you know, if there, for some reason, no credit clearance market occurs, but a facility has not met their compliance obligation, the executive officer will make note of that in what's called an accumulated deficit and require retirement of that balance plus interest of 5% within 5 years. And to note down here, if you want to sell within the credit clearance market, if one actually exists that year, you must have submitted your annual compliance report ahead of April 30th. You must have been in compliance the previous year and have no accumulated debt deficit. And then, like I mentioned earlier, some items to consider for the pricing. So there will be a maximum base price. For 2016, it's $200 a credit. And then every year after, CARB will use a price adjustment based on the annual CPI deflator, which is available via the web for you to understand. That will adjust for inflation on the credit pricing. This slide just demonstrates what would be deemed as invalid credits, and then goes over what CARB has available to them as enforcement. There's a little bit of flexibility in this, so it's not all clear as to exactly what would happen in the market in terms of fraud, in terms of what can happen for suspension or revocation. But CARB does say that each deficit that was not retired at the end of the compliance period that's deemed invalid could be subject to a penalty that will not exceed $1,000 per day per deficit. Similarly, I've listed from the regulations just a few of the items that could be deemed as invalid credits or a miscalculation of your deficit, or even if there is an issue to be found with your approved CI value. So you could see that there was falsification of anything that you submitted documentation-wise to get your approved CI value. You would also see that there could be an incorrect documentation of a credit transaction. And then if you, as a regulated party, fail to actually produce required records for your annual compliance, whether it's during an initial quarterly report or an annual compliance, or if it's a follow-up request from CARB. And so listed down below would just be an overview of the process. So CARB would release a notice of initial determination of violation, and when a party receives that violation notice, they have 20 days to respond. If it moves past that point, then there's an interim account suspension. So this would prevent you from doing any kind of generation of credits or transfer of credits. If it moves past this phase, when CARB reaches a final determination, you would have, and they have to do so within 50 days, then the facility must either submit any additional documentation or they'll go back to business as usual. And then following the determination, you'd have 60 days. If it involves a credit purchase to offset your obligation, you'd have 60 days to do that. So with that, I'll kick it back over to Will for some from fuel type specific growth opportunities.
Thanks, Jackie. So there's a lot of different fuel types, obviously, to talk about, and we unfortunately don't have time in this presentation to go into all of them, but we wanted to highlight what we thought were some of the interesting areas in terms of what's changed since the regulation before, and also what CARB is seeing as their major growth areas. So we wanted to touch on some of those fuel types. So what you're looking at in this graph here is, this comes from CARB's illustrative compliance scenario. So this isn't necessarily prescriptive. Obviously, LCFS is a market-based program, but they laid this out as to how the requirements can be met by the credits that they think will be out there. And it's an interesting exercise to dig into this and see what they think is available, because there was a lot of research behind it. And so what you can see there is that you have major increases in credits generated by electric vehicles. You have renewable diesel remaining important or becoming even more important. And you also have biogas becoming increasingly important. And ethanol, especially corn ethanol, taking up a smaller share of the credits that will be generated out towards 2020 and even 2025. So again, just another way to look at this, and this is broken out by both gasoline and diesel. On the left hand, you see what they expect the major contributors to be in 2016, and then on the right you see 2025. And just to highlight again some of those major changes, electricity, they're expecting over 3 million credits to be generated in 2025. Cellulosic ethanol is a major growth fuel as well. And cane ethanol, of course, that's one that everyone is talking about. How many Brazilian ethanol plants are going to be registering for LCFS? With diesel, renewable diesel, which was the top fuel in 2016, becomes an even larger player. Renewable natural gas also is a major growth fuel. So one of the major drivers of what's going to be the next big fuel, how are they predicting kind of thing, goes into CI values, and those CI values all end up being equated to what kind of credit price people are getting. So obviously this depends on what the credit price is trading at, but this is a good exercise just to see sort of what potential is out there. And this is based on using a range of $50 to $150 per credit, and it's by credits per gallon of fuel produced. And so you can see there at the top biodiesel and renewable diesel, and those are also big ranges because the feedstock plays an important role with those. And then closer to the bottom are, you have cane ethanol, sorghum ethanol, and corn ethanol. But there's still a lot of value there, especially with the amount of fuel in those categories that are produced. One thing I quickly wanted to note with this chart is everything here is in a price per gallon cost, but except for the electricity, which is price per kilowatt hour. And I'll get into those prices a little bit later, but I just wanted to highlight that because they're actually, they tend to be one of the more valuable fuels in terms of the credit value you can produce. One way to look at that, at least for electric vehicles, is that if you drive 100 miles in an electric vehicle, or if someone's charging, let's say, for driving 100 miles in that vehicle, you're looking at a credit generation of somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 cents. So that's pretty substantial. So going back to ethanol, this is what the illustrative compliance scenario has going between 2014 and 2025. again, you see cane ethanol and cellulosic ethanol becoming a much bigger part of the story in 2025. One of the big questions there is, where is it going to come from right now? Well, DuPont has a new cellulosic ethanol facility. There's still not a lot out there. Other people wonder about the cane ethanol and how much demand for that ethanol will be in Brazil. So these are big questions, and right now CARB is banking a lot on those two types of ethanol, so it'll be interesting to see how this develops. Even if there is all that excess Brazilian ethanol, for example, one of the big questions will be, will market forces with the credit prices force all that ethanol to end up in California? If you look at their explanation for their scenario, right now they're expecting about 60% of Brazil's exported cane ethanol to go to California, so it's quite substantial. Again, just showing the cane ethanol growth, and I wanted to show this because, again, this is one of the more talked about things. Even if you start to look at news sources in Brazil, they're talking about LCFS, so they know it's going to be a big factor for ethanol producers there. And part of the reason we're expecting some of these changes were the CI changes that were made with the new regulation. There was obviously a lot of back and forth going about ILEC values for both types of ethanol, and CARB did end up revising corn ethanol, and it ended up with a lower CI value. But the same happened with sugarcane ethanol as well. So as you'll see, the sugarcane ethanol definitely ends up with a much lower CI value, so those credits will certainly be valuable. This is one of the things that CARB was looking at when they're putting together this kind of projection. What you're looking at is the OECD's forecast for Brazilian ethanol production. And a lot of this is up in the air, and it's just a projection, especially when it comes to demand. I know demand in Brazil can depend a lot on different market forces, but it's nonetheless interesting to see, especially because this is what CARB was using. And so you see that there's definitely enough ethanol, that trade balance represents what's available for export. And there's enough there, even if California ends up receiving less than 60%, but there are a lot of what ifs with this scenario. One of the other really interesting changes, I think, with their compliance scenario is the EV growth. And part of the reason that's so interesting is that it's going from one of the smallest sources of credits to becoming one of the largest sources of credits. So a lot of this is built on projections for electric vehicle adoption in the state, but there's some other interesting things going on in there as well. CARB did a lot and made a lot of changes on how the regulated party is figured out with this one, because there was a lot of talk with, I believe they called them stranded credits that they saw as being available for generation, but no one was opting in and registering. So some of those initial credits will likely come from some of those stranded credits previously, but obviously they're also banking on a lot of growth of electric vehicles and the charging infrastructure as well. So getting into who is the regulated party for EV, and this was one of the issues that was somewhat contentious in the comments, and it was also possibly misunderstood when reading through the regulation. It reads almost like the distribution utility is the default generator for all EV credits, and it certainly comes across that way, and they are the default generator for any residential credits. Or in other words, they're the only party that can claim residential credits. no families or whoever can like generate credits off of their own vehicle or anything like that. But utilities can, and there's not a meter requirement with that as well, so they can use estimations for based on how many electric vehicles are in their territory and estimations of how much charging is taking place. But when it comes to workplace charging or public charging, EVSPs or fleet owners can also opt in and claim credits for those. And this is where I think there was some confusion in the regulations that I'll address in the next slide. But I wanted to briefly touch on the requirements that go along with claiming these credits, because it's not as simple as some other fuel types of just you do the infrastructure and you claim the credit. Especially with the utility, you have to prove out that you are using the proceeds of these credits to benefit future EV customers. So that's a big one, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, like what kind of investment that CARB requires for this. Even the EVSPs or fleet owners have to provide education and show to CARB the kind of education that they're providing to people. So you don't just get to generate the credits off of what's already available. You do have to do some of these other things. One interesting distinction, though, is that for the public charging stations, obviously the EVSP to qualify would have to be the one to build and maintain that charging infrastructure or contract with someone to do it. But if they do not make that claim, the EDU can claim those credits without being the one to actually build out the infrastructure. And so I just wanted to clarify something with this, and there was some talk that with the new regulation, CARB made it so the distribution utilities get to claim all credits for EV if they wanted to opt in. But I wanted to put up, there was an answer to a question that we thought was interesting, that I think CARB makes it very clear that if an electric vehicle service provider does want to opt in, that they're the ones that make the infrastructure, that they can opt in. And I think one of the important words here is that they will supersede the utility's claim. So CARB will notify the utility that they can no longer generate credits on that claim, and the idea is to prevent double counting there. But I think that was something that wasn't clear in the original regulation, that they tried to clear up in the comments, that the EVSP can supersede that EDU claim if it is infrastructure that they built out. And I'm just going to touch on this really quickly because we're running short on time, but many of you might have heard about PG&E in the news, originally wanting to build 22,000 charging stations. That later got lowered to 7,500, but there's been a lot of debate over whether or not that's in the best interest to the ratepayers in that area, and a lot of that debate goes into who's going to be in control of the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So in a way, CARB has really entered this debate as well, and so it'll be interesting to see how that develops. Another major player is going to be biogas going forward, and that's almost without a doubt. You can see here some of the big CI changes with the new regulation are for CNG and LNG, both of which in most cases will increase. And so it really makes it attractive for people that already have the infrastructure for natural gas for their fleet of vehicles to look towards biogas, because they're not going to be able to generate a whole lot of credits off of traditional CNG or LNG. But biogas is still one of the lower CI values, and there is a lot of potential growth in that market in terms of feedstock availability. So there will definitely be some growth there in the future. Another major one that's already a big player now, but will even make up a larger portion of the compliance, is renewable diesel. The picture you're looking at there is the Neste facility in Singapore, which I believe is not the largest, it's one of the largest renewable diesel plants in the world. And CARB is counting on some of this international capacity definitely to go towards its markets. but they also made a point of highlighting that there is a lot of domestic capacity that some available now and even more that's online. They see most of the renewable diesel being made up of tallow primarily, and followed by corn oil and soybean oil. Excuse me. And they did look at feedstock availability. Obviously, used cooking oil is somewhat limited, but especially with corn oil and soybean oil, they see that there's a lot of potential feedstock availability for that market to grow. One of the criticisms of this, though, is just the infrastructure build out that will be required to build these new facilities, especially with the regulatory uncertainty. So there's a little bit of a question mark of whether or not that will happen. But the incentive is definitely there, as you can see with what the credit prices are for some of these different feedstocks. And now Jackie is going to go in real quick to some ideas for verification and monitoring, and talk about what CARB has been considering in the past.
Thanks, Bill. So if we're looking at providing an LCFS verification or monitoring solution similar to what we already do within the EPA's RFS2, you know, things to consider if you're looking at proactively preventing fraud. You could get involved in an LCFS verification service system through Genscape. This would allow for, you know, a minimized potential for CI value credit generation. Like we talked about earlier, there could be fraud in just or even just error in general in some of your reporting techniques, or missing documentation, or issues with developing the CI and reporting it accurately. I should note here that, you know, Genscape doesn't handle registrations, and we don't do anything around registrations, but, you know, moving forward, there could still be issues with your CI if you're under like a mixed feedstock facility or anything like that. So you're always kind of reassessing and making sure that before credit generation occurs that your CI value is appropriate. Within an LCFS credit system like Genscape has for quality assurance, you'd have increased market transparency. There would be an oversight of your LRT activity for reduced risk. We issue what we call Genscape approved certificates. These are for anyone buying the credits to receive that additional level of assurance. And then there's more efficiency around your quarterly and your annual reporting. So I'll just give a really quick overview because I want to make sure that we get to the questions and answers portion. So you'll see here what we do is we deliver quality assurance via an ongoing monitoring process. Now this can, you know, involve a variety of things, but typically it includes, you know, twice a year site visit if you have no monitoring, or once a year site visit with a monitoring plan. Some of that is variable based on the fuel type or the producer's elected QAP process. And I should say, you know, a lot of our customers, especially under our EPA-approved QAP, have received premium prices on their credits. And again, there's that increased level of assurance for the regulated or obligated parties, and so that allows for really strong market relationships. This is a quick overview of how we provide the real-time monitoring. So, you know, for feedstock, some examples would be, you know, transportation via truck, rail, or barge. We implement pump sensoring or storage level monitoring. We do an ongoing assessment of your processing and energy usage, again, via a few different types of measurements, whether it's a pump sensor or an IR heat signature. And then more importantly, the fuel output, again, a variety of techniques used there. And then we monitor your transportation, and then more importantly, especially tied to the LCFS, certainly the downstream importing activity into California and the transportation used for all of the validation required under LCFS. This next slide just demonstrates quickly, you know, it's a pretty quick facility monitoring implementation timeline from, you know, signature on paper to basically when you can get the go-ahead for an approved facility on our biofuels dashboard. We look at that between 60 to maybe 90 days depending on scheduling. We try to make everything really fast and easy for the facility, and we try to do as little overall documentation collection on an ongoing basis as possible, just again to streamline. So monitoring, that's our big thing at Genscape. Here are some of, I'm just going to provide this really quickly of a few of the things that we think could be areas of concern for risk. Feedstock, you could have mixed feedstock not being appropriately accounted for. Maybe you use a different transportation method than what's in your approved pathway, all the way down to not following the right retirement scheme for the credits within the LRT. Again, you can review these in more detail or certainly reach out to us and ask any additional questions that you might have. We prefer to, make sure that there aren't any similar issues within the LCFS market as what the RIN market experienced several years ago. Same thing here, an example of feedstock, the points at which we would monitor via either, documentation of your feedstock and transportation vendors, looking at company transport coming in and out of a facility, monitoring levels for production and storage, and we can do this via a variety of options, even as sophisticated as tying into your PLC data ingestion system if that exists. So I'll leave it at that for the QAP solution side of things, and then we'll lead into questions and answers as we have a few minutes left in the webinar. Again, if for some reason we can't get to all of the questions, typically what we do is we go through the questions and we usually follow up with a questions and answer document that will be sent out to anybody that registered and attended the webinar. So with that, Will, do you have any questions to tee it off with?
Sure, Jackie. We've received various forms of this question, but to summarize it, there are a lot of feedstock producers out there that are interested in getting into the LCFS market, but obviously, like you discussed in the beginning, they can't opt in as a regulated party themselves. Can you talk about how they might take part in LCFS?
Yeah, so they're not part of the moving forward to the new LCFS. They'd have to apply through a joint application with a fuel producer, and then technically that fuel producer would be granted the certified pathway for the CI value, and then between the feedstock producer and the fuel producer there would be a mutual agreement as to who benefits from the credits, but again the fuel producer would be the owner of the credits, the generator of the credits, and there would just be some subsequent agreement between the feedstock only and the fuel producer.
Great. Relating to verification, we have a question, and this is something that I think ARB has maybe addressed, but it still isn't totally clear. Their question is, will there be tracking or some sort of identification with LCFS similar to RINs, specifically for fuels that are changing hands multiple times? How will the buyer be able to track those credits?
So it's not quite as clear, like you said. So getting into a system like what Genscape provides with LCFS credit monitoring would definitely add that level of assurance. There would be a certificate that comes along with the credit generation and follows through the generation, the buyer, and any downstream use from there. So, and to your point, it's not been explicitly stated, but I know that it's part of the ongoing discussions.
And I believe also, just to add to that, I think CARB has talked about adding more technical capability in terms of unique tracking IDs to the credits, but there's nothing that's been finalized with that.
Yeah, the only thing I kind of have heard a little bit about is, if you have a U.S. EPA RFS2 company ID, that'll be assigned to you as the facility ID within the LCFS, but that won't necessarily be assigned to your credits as generated.
Okay. And that leads into another question, since you mentioned having an RFS2 ID. For someone that's been an RFS2 producer, has generated RINs for maybe years, Is it easier for them to register for LCFS, or can they just somehow automatically use their RFS2 registration to generate LCFS credits?
So they cannot use their RFS2 registration to get into the LCFS system. Elements of their RFS2 registration would be required, like an engineering review. And I know that that's come up in the questions as well in terms of how old or how new the engineering review has to be, whether it's 6 months or a year. I'm not quite clear as to whether or not it needs to be as new as 6 months, but it certainly has to be new and approved and within the standards of the EPA's RFS2 if that's your engineering review that you're using. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have a couple related questions about, who is actually eligible for the legacy pathway recertification.
Okay.
And so maybe if you could just get into that a little bit. Their specific example was a biodiesel producer that has a soy feedstock.
Something to always consider with the legacy pathway is that, unfortunately, so like Tier 1s are not going to be eligible for a legacy recertification. You can always submit for a legacy recertification for review by CARB and have discussions with CARB directly, but so Tier 1, not eligible. I think I discussed it earlier in terms of producers who have valid Method 2A and 2Bs under the previous regulation are eligible, or who have a valid Method 1 where there's a reference pathway that now exists in the new Tier 2 lookup table. So always reference the Tier 2 lookup table as an extra, added level of assurance. And again, I mean, if you have like documentation that proves that you are under steady state operations, that's crucial. Or if you do not wish to update any parameters and you just want to have ARB determine that for you, you can have that, as part of your process as well.
Okay. Let's do one more question, and this is about foreign-based companies, and they're interested in the schedule that CARB is going to review, and I'm imagining that this is more about Brazilian ethanol than anything else. So their question is, are foreign-based companies at a disadvantage in terms of priority for registration?
Yeah, so CARB is really going to make sure that as long as you get in ahead of that January 31st, 2016 deadline, that there's not really preference based on domestic versus international. They're going to just try to handle it based on the fuel type. So Brazilian ethanol gets in before January 31st. They shouldn't be slighted compared to a domestic ethanol producer. Again, everything would be released on the same date anyways for that batch fuel release date. So hopefully you would get it in before January 31st, no issues, and then you'd be granted the same CI date as the others in that category.
Thanks.
Great question, though.
Well, it looks like we're at the end of our allotted time, and we don't want to take up the rest of everyone's day, but we encourage everyone to please continue to submit questions, and we'll definitely try to follow up with that question and answer document. And we're also happy just to field emails if someone has something specific to their facility. So with that, I think we're going to end it.
The webinar will be available, the slides and the recording will both be available tomorrow, and then like we said, Will and I will dig through the questions that came in that we didn't have time to answer, and we'll send out as much information on those as possible in the next coming weeks. So thank you again for attending, and please reach out if you want to have a one-on-one with any additional questions. And we look forward to working with everyone in the future. And until then, let us know if you have any questions via email. Thanks.